Hi, my name's Dan Keane and I've just joined the composers here at Spitfire Audio. Today I'm going to show you how I composed a piece of music in the style of Ludwig Göransson's score for Tenet, taking inspiration from his use of post-production practices and compositional style, manipulating organic elements to create a dynamic, hybrid score, accented by the monthly highlight for March, Spitfire percussion. So I'm going to play you the track first and then we're going to dive into some of the techniques that I've used here today to emulate the feel of the soundtrack. So quite a short piece, but it looks to emulate all the different elements of kind of Göransson's techniques that he used for Tenet. And I'm just going to run through the project first. At the top here, I've got a couple of reverbs. I used the FabFilter Pro R. This is my kind of orchestral default, 3 seconds long. This second reverb is Cinematic Rooms, which I've only just recently started using, but it's really, really, really good. I've also got a little rear bus set up. This is a sort of production technique that's used sometimes as a sort of parallel compression. I don't tend to put percussion through this, but I'll put everything else through it, and it just helps to kind of homogenize things together a little bit. Then we've got this Spitfire percussion bus, which for the purpose of this tutorial is really just to show you just how much of the soundtrack has the percussion in it. And then as we make our way down the project, you can see here I've got various stems that I would typically export if I was sending this off to be dubbed for a film. So we've got our tuned percussion, low percussion, high percussion, metal percussion. As we go further down, we've got some strings, which I'll go into, and some chuggy strings, which have a slightly different send amount for reverb. So I've got them in a separate bus. And then we've got our brass, drones, and then at the bottom here we've got our kind of keyboard-based instruments. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, the highlight for this month is Spitfire percussion, and what I've really loved about using this library is that you don't actually have to use any reverb. You've got 3 mic positions here: close, tree, and ambient, and oftentimes you'll find that if you want a little bit more definition, you can push up the close mic, and if you want a little bit more reverb, you can push up the ambient or the tree microphones. And so for the purpose of writing this piece, I was really specific about my use of the different mic positions. You'll see at times with like the bass drum, I've got a close sound and then a wide sound. And as we go through the project, you'll see that I'm using these mic positions to get a little bit more punch, a little bit more definition, where otherwise it might get lost in the kind of the scope of the room. As you can see, we've got a lot of percussion in this piece. And if I just play this section here, section C, We need to get the definition from some of those elements, but we also want the sense of scale, the hall at Air Studios. So I'm going to run through each section. This is really the only time I'm going to run through chronologically, because I think for the purpose of this video, it would be more helpful to you to be able to see the different techniques that Ludwig Göransson used in Tenet, and then how I've used them throughout the score. First of all, we've got section A, which for me is really the kind of cinematic sound. We've got low brass, we've got the kind of sweeping strings, we've got little bits of ear candy and rhythmic accents, things like that. So a couple of key things here that I just wanted to emulate. First of all, we've got these little snares which have been tuned really heavily. So I'll go and show you how I've done that later on. We've got these sweeping strings here, which kind of have a lovely portamento slide between them. This is studio strings. We've got these reversed swells from Abbey Road. Just to give it a slight kind of hybrid edge. Moving on to section B, this is where things start to kind of build up a little bit more of a kind of action sequence. I've got this little riff here, which is being played on the cellos. And again, I've post-produced these quite heavily, so you'll see how I've done that later on. I'm also using the Spitfire studio strings, but I'm using the time machine mode set to spiccato, and so I've stretched the notes in a kind of negative direction, so it's really, really biting. But again, I'll show you more of that in a little while. We've also got quite a lot of rhythmic features here. Something that I find Göransson does a lot in his music is he'll figure out ways to make rhythmic sounds sound a little bit kind of unusual, a little bit different. So in some cases here, I'm reversing audio, stretching audio, things like that. So that's a shaker going backwards. Something that worked really well was this cowbell. So that is literally just by reversing a little bounced in place sound. Then this is sort of where things get a little bit too crazy in section C. For this, I'm trying to emulate his kind of interest in prog-inspired riffs. So even though it is technically in 4/4, there's quite a bit of unusual kind of ambiguity in the meter. We're not quite sure what meter we're in. I'm also doing a little bit of metric modulation here, which is basically where you create the feel from one tempo ramp to another, but it changes the feel of things. So for example, if I play this with the metronome, we've got these 16th notes, so they're playing kind of semiquavers. But then when we move to this section, pretty much the same notes, but it's played as triplets. But when you play from one to the next, you shouldn't be able to tell that the tempo's changed. So this is something that Göransson's done quite a lot to help build up a little bit more action, a little bit more adrenaline. We're able to increase the tempo by quite a lot, but you don't necessarily realise that it's happened in that way. I've also got quite low kind of stabby notes, which I think sound kind of proggy, but maybe he'd disagree with me on that. And we've got quite a few other little elements in there as well. I'm trying to manipulate some of the sounds by combining with synthy elements as well to give a more kind of hybrid texture. And that's particularly helpful using sound dust, which again, I'll go into later. Then finally, we've got this sort of come down section, I suppose. It's a little bit uneasy. Again, I'm using a drone here that I've made out of a flute and a solo violin. And that last chord sort of suggests there could be a little bit of foreboding. Maybe we're not kind of in the clear just yet. I've got this lovely little dulcitone 1884 edgery. And again, that's pretty much straight out of the box. There's quite a bit of reverb there because I wanted it to feel a little bit kind of, a little bit edgier, I suppose. But all of the delays and stuff are just built straight into the instrument. You'll also notice here I've created a drone of my own. So basically what I did was I grabbed the crotales here, really, really close. I wanted to get the bite of the attack, and this is just what the note sounded like. Sounds fine. I then put it through an 8-second reverb, but this is the little play. I wanted a little bit of modulation afterwards. And I'm not necessarily interested in when it actually hits, I'm more interested in the tail afterwards. So I bounced this in place and then reversed it. And then all I did was just dragged it down into a quick sampler, which you can do quite easily in Logic. And this is where I started to get a little bit more creative. I got the Echo Boy out by Soundtoys. And then I've got the decapitator as well, just to give it a little bit of a kind of crunchy edge. It's still quite dark sounding, but just to kind of suggest that it's a little bit dirtier than it might have been. Now this pairs particularly well with the drone I made using the flute and the violin. And when we combine that then with the sound dust too as well, we just get this lovely kind of ambience that builds up around the pad. And that's just how I started the piece. I then kind of come back to it later on using the drone again with both the crotales and the flute and violin drone. So it's gentle enough that you know it's sort of off in the distance, but I don't know, it suggests there's a little bit of foreboding, there's something just around the corner potentially. So let's go back in now and address each of those points in turn. We've started with the drones. The next thing I want to show you here is just these sweeping strings. You'll notice in quite a lot of cases that I've done quite a bit of post-production, which we'll get into. So here I'm using the studio strings. And the reason I've used this is because I like the slightly smaller section sizes, but also when you use a slightly less ambient room, you just get a little bit more control over the sound. And in this case, I was going to use the Echo Boy by Soundtoys just to give it a kind of slight hybrid atmosphere. I've then also combined this with the basses as well, but they're not going through the echo. I thought that would get a little bit too muddy. The main thing that really adds the weight for me in this section is these gong drums. So if I just play one of these notes. So without any of the effects, this is what it sounds like. And I was like, that sounds quite tuneful, you know? So then I've basically tuned it so that I can find the right frequency that I wanted. And then I've used an EQ to really boost that frequency loudly, so we know exactly what frequency that is. Then I've used the decapitator just to kind of destroy it a little bit, which gives it a kind of, I don't know, a slight kind of sub-bass line, which I really like. I've then used the EQ again just to kind of pull out some of the frequencies I liked and pull away some of the crunch that you built up from the decapitator. And also to kind of avoid too much build up below the frequencies that I wanted as well. I've then used a tremolo plugin just to give it a kind of slight sense of pulsing, which it was already doing actually because of the decapitator plugin. So that works really well. And in the context of the whole mix, this is what it sounds like. You can see I've done this later on as well in section B. Just kind of helps to build things up. You'll notice though that I've got a couple of different iterations. So in this case, I've basically done exactly the same thing, but then I've retuned it, repositioned the EQ positions and things like that. So I can actually sort of play a bass line. And when combined with everything else, you can see I've used low brass just to build up that low end a bit more. When combined with the timpani as well, which in this case I've taken from Spitfire percussion, but I've tuned it down by a whole octave, so it really gets quite gnarly down there. Now, while we're on the topic of sort of tuned percussion that I've taken and messed around with a little bit, have a listen to these snares. So this is something that Göransson does a lot in his score for Tenet. I don't know if it's actually a snare drum. It sounds like a snare combined with maybe something from his modular synthesis rig. I know he's got quite a lot of those external synths. Basically, without any of these effects, this is what it sounds like. So I've had to really go in and kind of invasively tune the notes out of it a little bit. But here we are. Just pulled up that frequency quite simply. I really love the Pro Q3 from FabFilter for this. It's just very, very musical, and you can use the keyboard down here to kind of move your frequencies around. Really, really helpful. I've then used this Aphex Vintage Exciter here. This is a plugin from Waves, and I just really like it for kind of pulling out those upper frequencies. There's a little bit of kind of analog emulation in there as well, but it just works really well on percussion. And then I'm using another Waves plugin here, and this one is called Smack Attack. And basically, you can turn up the attack or turn down the sustain. So before it, and then with it, just a little bit more percussive. Kind of removes the hall from this library in that situation, but I kind of found that it worked quite well. Other little bits of percussion here, we've got things like this. I just wanted this to feel like a slight kind of undulating tone. With a lot of these things, you'll find that if you just have all the percussion playing at one time, it just gets far too noisy. So you really have to find little kind of nooks and crannies in the rhythm so that not everything is playing the same rhythm every time. And in this case, I've used Echo Boy here just to give us that little slight kind of call and response. So that works quite well. And again, I find that this really emulates the way that Göransson writes. In particular, just trying to make more of a hybrid sound. I've got things like these tuned vibraphones here, which in the context of the piece sounds like this. I've also got the same thing here. And the reason it kind of comes up like that is because I'm using this LFO tool. So this is really like a sidechain thing, but you can kind of really adjust the envelope of that. And I find that it works really well if you just want a very specific kind of attack on the notes. Moving down, we've got this low strings basses here. This is from the Abbey Road low strings. This is from Orchestral Foundations, and I've tuned it down a whole octave. So without these plugins, it sounds like this. Quite kind of meaty down there, but as soon as I've added the decapitator, it just adds to that kind of thuddy, grungy sound. I've also just kind of pulled down some of the frequencies at the very bottom because I don't actually need it to be too thuddy down there. And it's more for kind of picking up those upper frequencies that go really well with the timpani and also the gong drum as well. So it's sort of about picking out little kind of ingredients, I suppose, and putting them together. I just want to show you the way I've used the rhythms here, because this is something that Göransson does a lot in his music. He'll use rhythms and then figure out ways to make them sound a little bit different, a little bit strange. So if I take this shaker sound, for example, quite simple. I've just taken the bounce in place and I've just pulled a nice little fade on it. In the context of the mix, this is how it sounds. So it's sort of coming up to beat one and then down again. And then I've literally just duplicated it, but then I've reversed it the other way. And so the way to do this really is just to find out where those notes hit and just kind of make sure that it's the kind of sharpest point of the transient, I suppose, that's hitting on those beats. Otherwise, you're going to have like, you want ticka, 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 ticka. And so when we combine them both together, we get this sound, which sounds a little bit unnatural on its own, but in the context of the mix, I think it just helps to give a little bit more ebb and flow. Now, I mentioned the cowbells before. I kind of foreshadow things a little bit by bringing them in a little bit earlier. Again, just as a kind of a build-up to beat one. But things really kind of take their own with the cowbells when I get here to section B. Now again, this is as easy as just literally turning it around. I also did the same thing with this bit of percussion as well, which is really just this, but turned around and kind of messed around with a little bit, which I think works really, really well. Now, speaking of the kind of raw percussion on their own, I'm using the muted percussion here just to give it a sense of kind of immediacy. And this is probably a good point to demonstrate the different mic positions. So I'm using mostly close here. But if I pull up the tree and pull down the close, very, very different sound. Same thing goes for the ambience as well, which are particularly wide. Now, if I just loop this section for a moment, you can get as much resonance as you might want out of these instruments by using the mic positions and not having to use the reverbs as well. I find that to be really, really helpful, and is one of the only libraries I've seen where the mic positions do, you know, really genuinely transform the sound from being really far away to being absolutely really, really close. You'll notice other kind of little bits of percussion here that I'm using with a little bit of the Echo Boy again. I just find that anything that has a little bit of a delay to it, it just helps to kind of keep that momentum going a little bit more. Speaking of other little bits of kind of post-production that I've done, this is a ratchet, which on its own sounds a little bit insignificant. But in the context of everything else, I think this really helps to kind of build into those sections. Now, looking down here at the bass drum, you can see that I've got the close mics turned up pretty much all the way with the tree, which gets a particular sound that you might like. But then I've also got this where I'm using a lot of the ambient and a lot of the tree mics, and I can get a much wider sound. You can see here I've also turned it down by 12, so it's stretching out the space in that room as well. But when we combine both of them together, this kind of feeds into Göransson's love of kind of cinematic sounding music. Now, I've got this little field drum here. This is something I've noticed that Göransson does a lot in the Tenet score. He'll combine multiple percussion elements together as a slight kind of rhythmic shift. So I've got these in kind of 3 semiquaver groups, and if you listen with the metronome, it kind of throws you off a little bit. Now, in the context of the beginning of this section, doesn't sound too bad. But the way I've managed to jump from one section into the next with this faster metric modulation is by actually just adjusting the volume of the tambourines and these field drums. Now, this really is so that I can get people into the feeling of that feeling that kind of triplet sound. Even though the tempo completely changes, that's the thing that drives that tempo shift. Because that then becomes the metronome speed. So with this metric modulation, we've basically changed the meter from a feeling of 4 into a feeling of 3. Next, just little rhythmic features here that I've used, and this again is trying to emulate Göransson's style in Tenet, is to find kind of little side riffs and things like that. I don't know how inspired he was by kind of progressive rock and metal, things like that, but I really hear it, particularly in his kind of use of synthesizers to create just little kind of turning phrases. You can see I've thrown in a couple of 3-4 bars just to kind of throw people off the scent slightly. And I find also that this adds to the slightly schizophrenic sound world that he's created. And if you just listen to this little line, we're really, really close. And then I've also combined it with the Coleño as well. Which, when you kind of combine them together, especially with the percussion as well, it just adds to a whole load of kind of clicks and what I call ear candy. So that can be particularly helpful as well. You can see here I've also used this drone again. And I find that by using the Coleño Trato here, we're able to get a really kind of intimate sound that sounds quite kind of fragile, really. I've tuned it up by a whole octave here, and the reason for that is because you're able to get a little bit more tone from the bottom registers, but by shifting it up, there's just a bit more body there. Doesn't sound quite as fragile as it might have done. And then this flute here is just the flute solo from Studio Woodwinds. Again, by being in a slightly drier, slightly less ambient space, you're able to get a little bit more control over the sounds. Now, I haven't actually used sound dust all that much in this middle section, but my main reason for using it here is just to kind of combine the hybrid textures of what the strings are doing, the lower strings. So if we just break down what this low string line is doing, we're using the cello here, and this is again from Spitfire Studio Strings, and this is the time-stretched time machine mode using spiccato. So if I didn't have this turned on, this is what it would sound like. As soon as I pull it up, it sort of sounds a little bit more like a kind of palm-muted guitar, I suppose. And I know that Göransson uses that quite a lot in his scores. So then what I've done is I've just sent this to a bus, and I'm just using a fairly basic Logic amp here just to give it the kind of style of it going through an amp. Now, the reason I've sent it through a send as opposed to putting it directly on the track is because I want to really monitor how much of the amp signal is coming through, and I found that it was just more helpful to be able to have that on a separate track rather than having to modify and change the send amounts kind of within the instrument. What I've also done is I've then double tracked it. So this is just on the right side of the room as you'd expect it. But then from this section onwards, we've actually got it on both sides. Now, it's just using one amp, so there might be a little bit of distortion there, which is quite nice. But the main way I've done this is I've swapped the left and right. So we've got what would have been on the right now completely on the left. But the other thing I've done is I've turned it down by 3 and then pushed the MIDI up by 3. So we're activating a different set of samples. I know this is something that Christian has mentioned on this channel before, but it just helps to give you a slightly more kind of double-tracked sound. Now this is then combined with the violas. And again, I put it through an amp as well, but I found that lower frequencies just kind of felt a little bit better in the context of what I was kind of trying to make. This then builds alongside the high percussion. So I basically just decided a random rhythm pretty much. I knew that it had to be in triplets, and so all I did was just kind of play single notes on a piano sketch, which some of you might know, is the way I tend to write my music. I'll just kind of write it out in a little sketch, and then I just kind of filled out the rhythms, really. Now, I'm using the timpani, but this is a hard, close sound. Which, if you compare with the softer sound, it sounds completely different. It sounds like a different instrument altogether. So I really like that. But I didn't want to lose the riff that we just built up. So I decided just to put it into the col legno. And again, this is slightly frenetic, but I think this just helps to kind of add to that sense of rhythm. If I play without it, we don't have as clear a kind of rhythmic backbone. Now, I hope when you first heard this, you thought, oh, that sounds a bit weird. I don't know what time signature this is in. I don't know what key we're in, things like that. I find that Göransson does this a lot, especially in the Tenet score. He's trying to find little moments that he can kind of shock you or kind of push you back a little bit. And what I hope is that by the sort of second half of this, you've got a much clearer idea of where the rhythm is. Now, not a huge amount has changed between that and this. It feels kind of lost at the beginning, and the main thing that makes it different is that I've added this steady cowbell. Whereas before it was playing the main kind of rhythm as before. Which is a little bit kind of difficult to get your hands on. You can see in little kind of breaks like that, I'm emulating the way that Göransson would often do this. He'd kind of literally just cut a whole section out and then say, right, what's going to go in place of this? I know, let's just add a little bit of kind of reverse cowbell, things like that. And that's the only thing that then plays. Just helps to give a little bit more life to it, kind of lets it breathe a little bit. Otherwise, it's quite kind of frenetic, quite full on. I've also used just a little bit of horn and trumpet shorts here, which again is just to kind of build up the adrenaline slightly and to give it that sense of the triplet feel. Now, in terms of like little bits of production here and there, I think I've explained already quite a few of the little effects that I've used, but I found that it was particularly helpful to use the SSL bus compressor from Waves just to help kind of keep the transients in check a little bit. So all of the percussion coming out of the buses is then routed through this Spitfire percussion bus, which again, I can kind of easily show you with a flick of a switch just how that sounds. But more importantly, I think when you've got lots of different elements going on, particularly recorded in big kind of reverberant spaces, sometimes the transient might catch up with you a little bit later than you might imagine. Things like bass drums that are being stretched out and tuned down, sometimes we won't notice that that transient is actually going to take a little bit longer to kind of emerge. So in some cases, I find that a bus compressor works really well, and I really like the sound of this Waves one. So you can see I'm not compressing too hard, about 2 or 3 dB at the kind of loudest points, and I'm doing this with an attack of 3 milliseconds. And had I done 10 milliseconds, I just found that it was just kind of overtaking the rest of the arrangement a little bit too hard. So 3 milliseconds works well for me. And then in terms of any kind of output kind of mastering, I use another SSL compressor, and in this case, as you can see, at the loudest point, again, still only compressing about 2 dB. I've then got this little Pro Q3, which I learnt from Jake Jackson you should use set to side for the kind of low frequencies and high frequencies. So this just helps to kind of broaden the stereo image a little bit without introducing too many phasing issues. I've then also got this Waves EQ here. This is just to kind of help give it a bit of a smile. I think we're all kind of tarts in that way. So I'm boosting about 2 dB on both the high frequencies at 10K and the low frequencies at 100 Hertz. And then I've finally just got this this tape machine, which again is from Waves, and this just helps to kind of give it a little bit of saturation that you don't otherwise get. And that's about it, really. I hope you found this video to be useful. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't done already. Lots of really exciting things coming soon. Stay safe, stay well, and I hope to see you on here soon.